Okay, welcome to everyone joining us for the panelists, my co-host David Simon, and the participants joining the symposium. I wanted to thank again David Simon from Yale Genocide Studies Program, and also Robert Prezant, the provost of Southern Connecticut State University, for his support, and the Judaic Studies program at Southern for their support of the symposium. And it's been been a great collaboration with David Simon, who's an able director of the Yale Genocide Studies program and committed to genocide prevention and global justice. And we've coordinated a number of events. I look forward to future events. Just before we begin, I wanted to mention that today we have a keynote address at 3:30 p.m., which is a little unusual time in terms of the symposium, but this to accommodate Haris Halilovic in Melbourne, Australia. So that hopefully those who are here will be able to stay and hang on for his important keynote address. Tomorrow we'll have two full panels and also a keynote by the High Representative Valentin Insko from 12 to 1 in between the two panels. So thanks again. I'm going to just explain how we're going to proceed. I'll introduce both of our speakers, and then they'll give their talks, and then we'll open for question and answers. And I'm not completely familiar with the Zoom webinar format, but David was explaining that there's a Q&A function you can use, they say, in addition to the chat function. So it worked very well in the last session. Be sure to send your questions, and David will help me monitor the questions. We'll try to get to as many as possible. The other thing I wanted to mention is that sadly, Tanya Domi could not be with us today because of a medical emergency. So we wish her well, and we hopefully will have a chance to include her in the next program and to hear her very important voice and her topic. But we're proceeding with our other scheduled speakers. So let me introduce Dr. Yasmin Mujanovic, a policy consultant, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Dialogue Southeast Europe, and he's a political scientist working on the politics of authoritarianism and democratization in Southeastern Europe, and the co-host of the regional podcast, Sarajevo Calling. So I thought that was an entirely too modest bio that he sent us, and I wanted to mention that he's such a well-regarded and prolific writer, writing important work for example, in Balkan Insight. And I'm even remembering his article from March 2020, which I'm paraphrasing the title, but addressing the issue of Dodik's enablers. It's a great phrase, Yasmin. So thank you very much for joining us today. And our next speaker will be Markéta Slavková at the Institute of Ethnology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. And Dr. Slavková specializes in the discipline of sociocultural anthropology with a focus on topics of the anthropology of food and war involving nationalism, transnationalism, and identity. And for her doctoral studies, she carried out extensive field work in Srebrenica, looking at the anthropology of food and this food scarcity during the siege of Srebrenica. Also in her case, I've been very impressed by her commitment to on-the-ground field work, building relationships with people in Srebrenica over the past decade, and then her scholarly work is emerging, and she was recently recognized. Her essay, Starving Srebrenica, Recipes for Survival in the Bosnian War, 1992 to 1995, received special commendation from the judges for the 2020 Sophie Co Award. So allow me to once again to get things started with Yasmin, whose paper is titled "The Politics of Bosnian Genocide Denial."
Thank you very kindly, David. It's a terrific honor to be here, and thank you also for that extremely generous introduction. And it's also obviously a great honor to be speaking at this really important event. And likewise, very grateful to the colleagues at Yale and Marketa as well for making time to share her knowledge about all of this. I'll also apologize ahead of time if there's the screaming of toddlers and infants in the background. That's just the reality of life presently. So I want to give a little bit of a preface as to my comments and where they're coming from. My kind of recent work has increasingly become focused on the kind of growing synergies and connections between Western far-right movements and Bosnian Serb nationalist, or Serb nationalist more broadly, revisionist discourses about the war in Bosnia and the broader dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. So there's echoes, obviously, of the events at Kosovo, and again, sort of the broader Yugoslav crisis in that sense. I think we're living through a really interesting moment. It's a disturbing moment, but it's an important moment. And I think it's important, especially as we're sort of marking this, very, very important symbolic anniversary of the end of the war in Bosnia and the genocide, that we also kind of take stock of how some of these discourses and narratives have evolved and are continuing to evolve, because these things have not remained static, right? And that's kind of to sort of give away, in a sense, the thesis of a lot of my work of late, which is to say that I think that discourses, and in particular the issue of revisionism and negationism of the Bosnian genocide, is an evolving topic. It's a mutating topic, and new forms of revisionism have begun to emerge. And the reason for that, fundamentally, is that new audiences have emerged for that revisionism. So I think one of the great curiosities of the present moment is the way in which Bosnian genocide denial has become a topic for strictly Western audiences. Right, and I'll unpack that a little bit more, but let's kind of just sort of review where we're at up until this point, right? So I mean, folks like, for instance, Eric Gordy and a lot of other very important scholars have done really important work, and obviously Holocaust scholars and genocide scholars more broadly know this as well, and built the foundations for this work. We know that not only are genocides systematic, not only are they programmatic, not only do they require bureaucracy, but negation and denialism is an integral part of the genocide process. And at the earliest stage, denial and negationism is happening as the killings are still going on. Right? We know this even from the Nazis. We know this from Rwanda. We know this from Bosnia, right? So the earliest forms, essentially, of genocide denial in the context of Bosnia are happening as there's still concentration camps on the ground, there's still rape camps on the ground, there are still killings going on, not just obviously in Srebrenica, but all the other sort of killing fields and locales of the broader Bosnian genocide. And that original form of negationism and denial obviously was heavily concentrated specifically on the Serb nationalist movement and community, right? It was fundamentally the project of people like Radovan Karadzic, the Milosevic regime in Belgrade, and their various apparatchiks, because this was instrumental to how they were going to execute this plan. So the audience there obviously was as much domestic, right? It was important to some extent to shield ethnic Serb communities from the true scale of the killings, while also simultaneously implicating obviously large members of that community as well. It was also important to inculcate the public in Serbia from the true nature of the killings and the genocide, but it was also extremely important to shield Western audiences and the international community from the true scale of the killings, because obviously Karadzic, Milosevic, Mladic, etc., they were very concerned about the prospects for international intervention, which obviously did come in the end, but very belatedly. So while that original form of negationism and denial was obviously heavily concentrated on local communities and local actors, right from the get-go, there was an international component. And also it's important to note at this point that, at the international level, there also were enablers and helpers of these narratives, right? So I trust at this point everyone is kind of familiar with the sort of the infamous incident of the Living Marxism group out of the UK. There was other negationist and denialist entities that were active in the political West at that time. But Living Marxism was probably the most prominent, partly because it also kind of became this, mini scandal in the UK vis-a-vis libel laws and all the rest of it. The interesting thing to pull out there, and something to note, and this will become sort of important for the latter part of my comments, is that I think initially, in terms of Western negationist denialist camps, the so-called quote unquote anti-imperialists were probably the most prominent, right? These are your self-styled left-wing, quote unquote, typically self-identifying Marxists and various other kinds of sort of far left groups who have an extremely, banal, for lack of a better term, but perhaps more scientifically, they have a binary view of international relations, right? Essentially, their view is that, the United States and kind of the broader political, or as they would put it, capitalist imperialist West, is, the single greatest threat to humanity. And therefore, any political entity opposing their purported imperialism is therefore an ally of self-styled anti-imperialists. So therefore, Slobodan Milosevic and Radovan Karadzic, in being opposed to the United States, in being opposed to the United Kingdom, were anti-imperialist allies, if not heroes, right? You can see weird mutations of that in the present. For instance, the support that the Maduro regime in Venezuela continues to enjoy from these folks, even, for instance, the regime in Iran. You go down the list, right? Muammar Gaddafi, et cetera, et cetera. It's a side topic that we don't need to get into, but suffice it to say, the anti-imperialist voice was very prominent. Now, there was a other relatively minor at that time camp in the Western negationist denialist community, and that was the far right. In the 1990s, these voices did exist. These were the folks who essentially bought very deeply hard into the narrative that was in particular coming out of people like Radovan Karadzic, which is that the war in Bosnia was fundamentally a clash of civilizations, and more to the point, it was a struggle over the defense of Christendom, right? So he was animating all those kinds of medievalist discourses, Byzantium on the frontier. Obviously, I think a lot of my colleagues, who do work on Holocaust studies in particular, have noted very astutely, I think, the kind of a borrowing that happens in these narratives from classic anti-Semitic discourses. There's antecedents into how we can understand this kind of in the broader context. Nevertheless, this front-loaded Islamophobic kind of crusader narrative was extremely popular among a segment of the far right. And that was kind of the state of play at the time, right? What then ends up happening over the next 2.5 decades, which essentially brings us up to the present, and I'm not going to go beat for beat for beat, but just to kind of very quickly blow through it, as it were, is obviously global politics changes categorically, right? The assumptions that we had about the nature of global politics in the 1990s, at least in the political West, those of us in the Balkans, not so much, thanks to the war, but all those good assumptions that we had about globalization, the triumph of global liberalism, et cetera, those obviously begin to fade. And I mean, the big shock fundamentally, categorically, obviously is 9/11. And 9/11 begins to change very, very categorically the nature of political discourse in the political West, and concerns obviously with Islamic extremism and Islamist terrorism, and the proliferation of Islamophobic discourses becomes a bigger and bigger feature of political discourse in the West. That begins the process, or rather renews the process of a particular kind of Bosnian genocide denial and negationism. And you already start seeing in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 how that far right version of the negationist denialist discourse begins to gain traction. Because suddenly now there's all these voices in the political West who are saying, hey, 9/11 didn't come out of the ether. It didn't come out of nowhere. Let us retell you the history of the post-Cold War period, right? And this is where you start seeing more and more and more interest in places like the United States and large parts of Western Europe, with the kind of Islamist dimension, the presence of Mujahideen fighters in Bosnia during the war, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that happens throughout much of the 2000s, and it's problematic in its own right. But I think the moment that really brings us to the present in a way is actually not so much, strictly speaking, 9/11, although it lays the groundwork. It is the period after the 2008 financial crisis. As you start seeing the dissolution of liberal democratic norms in the West, and as you start seeing the ascendancy of far-right populist and nationalist movements throughout the political West, initially in Europe, then in the United States, these voices are providing a wholesale categorical new vision, new narrative of history since the end of the Cold War. And for them, that discourse that people like Radovan Karadzic had in the 1990s about a eternal struggle for Christendom against the invading Muslim hordes becomes extremely attractive. Because for them, the concern obviously is with dismantling multi-ethnicity in the West, rolling back immigration, restoring what they understand to be sort of traditional Christian cultural norms. A few of them employ the language of Judeo-Christian norms, but for most it's Christian norms. And again, so we see the linkages between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And the very interesting and perverse thing that happens, and what I've started writing more and more about, is the way that, in particular, people like Radovan Karadzic emerge as these kinds of prophets of the new far right. And so when you start reading, for instance, the manifestos of Anders Breivik in Norway, or the terrorist from the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, you suddenly start seeing all of these references to Bosnia in particular, to Kosovo to some extent as well, but broadly speaking, the kind of discursive and narrative architecture that I've been describing, this notion of the battle over Christendom, invading Muslim hordes, the Great Replacement theory, all of these things in a way become crystallized or become exemplified for them through the events in Bosnia, right? And all their discourse and narratives about kind of demographic warfare, the changing nature of societies, the threat of liberalism, being outvoted by minorities, outbred by minorities, all these really perverse things. When they try to give you an exact example of what they're talking about, they cite Bosnia. And they cite accordingly people like Karadzic, people like Mladic as being prophetic in how they tackled this problem, that they understood, as it were, that the only way to deal with it, to quote actually a not technically far-right writer, a Canadian-British writer by the name of Mark Stein, who you would probably more characterize as being sort of on the proverbial hard right, but still sort of very much within the acceptable league of quasi-mainstream right-wing politics in the US and Canada, though definitely sort of on the margins. He has a book in the 2000s where he specifically talks about Bosnia, and he says his argument is, the Bosnian Serbs understood that when you're facing this kind of demographic challenge, there's only one answer. And he uses the phrase that you have to cull them, right? You have to cull, you have to kill, you have to get rid of that incipient group that is threatening to demographically replace you. So this is the way that these kinds of narratives and discourses become a bigger and bigger part of Western far-right discourses. And obviously the thing that's really alarming to me, and this is the last thing that I'll say, I think that the thing that's really frightening is the way, not just that Bosnian genocide denial has become now a kind of ideological pillar of the far right, in the way that, for instance, Holocaust denial is, or fascination with the apartheid regimes in Southern Africa during the latter half of the 20th century, or the Confederacy, right? All these kind of totemic ideas. It's not just that it's become part of that narrative universe. The really alarming thing to me is how very important aspects of the narrative vis-a-vis Bosnia that they employ, again, the demography aspect, the crusader narratives, invading Muslims, all of this stuff, how this has actually become, as I was saying about Mark Stein, how this is actually increasingly becoming acceptable discourse on the mainstream right? Or at the very least, right-wing movements that are proximate to the mainstream. This is, for instance, somebody like Viktor Orban, who peddles in anti-Semitic tropes and Islamophobic tropes, and would be characterized as an illiberal far-right figure most of the time, but at the same time continues to be within the EPP bloc, within the European Union, this sort of main center-right bloc in the European Union, right? So these are the kinds of things that I'm worried about, as it were, in the next 10, 15, 25 years of discourse about Bosnia, that this is now becoming increasingly the norm, that this is an acceptable feature of narratives about the Bosnian genocide. And I would even put to you very possibly that in segments of the West, at least, that this is becoming the primary narrative. Okay, so that's all I'll say for now. And I invite your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Uljanovic. And that's it's fair to say you've thematized genocide denial as an obstacle to transitional justice. So it's a appropriate segue to Dr. Slavkova's presentation on Srebrenica's recipes for survival, food as a weapon of war and a tool for transitional justice.
Thank you, David, for the word and the nice introduction. Let me get my presentation. Here it is. So I will start. Dear friends and colleagues, it is a great honor to be here with you today, at least virtually, and to be part of these truly important discussions on the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina 25 years after the Dayton. I believe that apart from other things, this conference shows that the ongoing COVID-19 pandemics cannot overshadow the need to discuss the post-war development in Bosnia, and that certain historical events cannot be simply overlooked or forgotten. As various social conflicts, including armed conflicts, are unfortunately becoming a more pressing reality in many places around the globe, whether in relation to the pandemics or other crises, there is also a growing need to critically rethink the notion and general practice of transitional justice. After all, when else than in these dramatic times is more important to continue to speak of genocide and other crimes against humanity, when else should be more relevant to also critically rethink the era of transitional justice in a more practical sense. My contribution to these debates offers a slightly unusual perspective, the one of food. In particular, I use the anthropology of food to illustrate various political, social, and economic processes which took place in Bosnia in the past 30 years. Today, I will similarly attempt to rethink the area of transitional justice in the relation to the domain of food, and I will ask what the recipes for both survival and well-being are. The presentation is structured into two parts. In the first one, I intend to theorize the social significance of food in wartime and show how intentional food deprivation went hand in hand with the process of Srebrenica genocide. By doing so, I want to underline the extent of suffering of the ordinary people, but also to emphasize the importance of satisfying basic human needs in terms of access to food. In the second part, I will focus on the post-war reconstruction in Srebrenica in relation to political, social, and economic marginalization and poverty. Last but not least, I will attempt to illustrate how the ordinary inhabitants perceive and experience the ideas and practices of transitional justice. Part 1, the war, starving Srebrenica and the recipes for survival. Bosnian War 1992 till 1995 broke out as part of the larger process of the disintegration of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. The politics of ethnic cleansing was used as part of the general warfare strategy in the 1990s conflict, spilling the violence from place to place in the newly emerging nation states. Ultimately, it was the ethnic cleansing which made the demarcation of the new nation states possible. In the former safe era Srebrenica, the persecution resulted in the act of genocide. The politics of ethnic cleansing, as well as the genocide, was executed in the locality mainly by the Bosnian Serb army under the command of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. The persecution was aimed against all non-Serb inhabitants, namely the population of Muslim origin. Approximately between July 11th and 1995, the Bosnian Serb army and other forces executed between 7,000 and 8,000 civilians or prisoners of the war. In reality, this number might be even higher. The majority of them were men and boys of Bosnian Muslim origin. According to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia at The Hague, the massacre and subsequent cover-up operations were planned well and well organized, and for that reason, the act was classified as a genocide. Unlike a massacre, genocide is defined as an intentional and a systematic attempt to destroy a targeted group of people, and this process is characterized by particular phases and an internal logic. In my own ethnographic and historical research, I additionally suggest that the mass starvation in besieged Srebrenica was at large extent intentionally imposed and can be accounted as a weapon of war, as well as one of the mechanisms of the genocide process. Food is a basic concern for all human societies, as many have pointed out, because food, along with vitamins, minerals, and other micronutrients, assures survival. This places the activity of providing, preparing, and consuming food in a very prominent position that is further reflected in human social systems and organization. For this reason, in a pretty much every armed conflict, obtaining and consuming sufficient quantities of safe and nutritious food, in other words, the food security, generally becomes one of the most serious issues. There are several reasons for this. The industrial production on which contemporary postmodern societies depend is generally disturbed and sometimes collapses entirely in the war. Economies of countries in war are generally being seriously destabilized. The import mediated by international trade is often threatened, and many of the countries in war are being placed under an embargo. In a result, as food becomes unavailable, its prices skyrocket, which makes the most basic food items unaffordable, namely for the ordinary people. Majority of the affected inhabitants in the Bosnian War were attempting to solve this problem, at least partially by self-provisioning. Nevertheless, in the besieged cities of Sarajevo and Srebrenica, the omnipresent snipers, as well as falling grenades, prevented at large the possibilities of growing and collecting food. Nevertheless, survival for the affected civilians, Nevertheless, collecting wild food from dandelions to slugs became one of the most crucial strategies for survival of the affected civilians, because the humanitarian aid deliveries often failed to feed the stomachs of the hungry. Suleiman Regic showed that collecting wild foods significantly increased the chances of survival. However, the besiegement of both Srebrenica and Sarajevo made these activities dangerous and even life-threatening. Overall, in Srebrenica, besiegement and the control of convoys, which were supposed to bring supplies to town, were the main reasons for food and salt shortage during the war. Numerous accounts of blocking convoys had been recorded. Honig and Buff describe how the humanitarian convoys were often stopped, searched, and even frequently returned by the Bosnian Serb army. This was confirmed by Tim and Lars, two of my research participants and eyewitnesses to the situation, who were both working for the UN Dutch peacekeeping forces in Srebrenica. They also suggested that the Bosnian Serb army were making sure that there was only a bare minimum of supplies reaching the enclave. Moreover, ever since the war, there have been articles and reports which suggest that biological and chemical warfare might have been employed in Srebrenica, in part, and that the deliveries of salt were intentionally blocked by the Bosnian Serb army in order to cause iodine deficiency and thus both physically and psychologically harm targeted non-Serb populations in Srebrenica and Jepa area. However, more historical research and accumulation of evidence is necessary to make further conclusions regarding this matter. Nevertheless, the employment of such a program would logically explain why salt was so carefully confiscated from the convoys. By underlining these specific moments in the 1990s Bosnian War, I aim to emphasize the extent of suffering caused by the mass starvation. Collinson and Macbeth argue that any intentional restriction of food by either of the sides of conflict is a weapon of war. Thus, controlling the resources of food and intentionally inflicting starvation can serve as an alternative to using firearms. However, in the case of Srebrenica, these military strategies seem to be used hand in hand to intensify suffering and harm to the targeted populations. The denial of the access to food and salt became some of the mechanisms of dehumanization and techniques of torture. Part 2, post-war presence, no truth for hungry stomachs, transitional justice, and the embodiment of hunger of the poor. In the second part, I will offer several insights to the post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina in relation to socioeconomic and political marginalization, poverty, and some emic ideas of transitional justice. Here, I intend to include several ethnographic vignettes in order to illustrate how the everyday life in post-war Bosnia, namely in the entity of Republika Srpska, where Srebrenica is also located, is perceived and experienced by some of the local inhabitants. In 2013, when I moved to Srebrenica to carry out my PhD ethnographic research, the country had been already several years undergoing complex transitions from war to peace. After almost a decade of intense post-conflict reconstruction, the signs of devastation and poverty were omnipresent. The town of Srebrenica was still noticeably damaged by the last war, and surrounding houses were covered by grenade and bullet holes. Quickly, I learned that the destruction was not only of the material character. What one couldn't see at the first sight was the destruction of communities and entire families, but also the profound changes in the ordinary lives, including something so intimate as eating patterns. In the early phases of my ethnographic fieldwork, the locals were curious what I was doing there. I explained that I came to research food as an anthropologist, which left most of the people surprised. "Food?" said one of the town's inhabitants. "Can't you see that there is no food?" This encounter at the beginning of my fieldwork made me puzzled, and eventually it also shifted my research topic, and I started to focus increasingly on hunger. In my PhD dissertation research, I came to the conclusion that the war not only left those who survived and returned to Srebrenica impoverished, but for many of them, the experience of long-term starvation during the war led to the embodiment of hunger. Many of my interlocutors summarized that the war spoiled their stomachs, and ever since the war, they did not have the right taste for food. In an everyday life, this simply meant not eating much, reducing the intakes of food to necessary minimum, and also often substituting meals with cigarettes and heavily sweetened coffee. At the beginning of 2014, I noted in my field diary, "One stops to eat, bodies grow skinny yet strong. Their stomachs like mine growl these days. Over past couple of months, I have adopted these nasty habits of not eating. I still eat more than some of the young guys around me, yet I feel weak." Not that there is a famine in contemporary Bosnia, but I have been noticing a sort of other type of hunger, one that seemed to be more omnipresent and which was born after the Dayton Agreement, when Bosnia emerged as a new country in transition, striving towards economic model driven by global neoliberal markets. This other type of hunger wasn't like the acute and chronic one in the war, directly threatening lives. In a way, its manifestations were harder to see. They weren't as striking and shocking for the eye of the observer as in the first case. People weren't dying of hunger in the streets, but they were living on bare minimum, and many of them would not be able to satisfy their dietary needs without food self-provisioning and support of their families and friends in times of crisis. One cold night, few of the Srebrenica youngsters who grew up as refugees and I were hanging out near the abandoned house on the hill above the town. We chatted, drank beer, smoked cigarettes, and shivered with cold. Adnan, the older twin, an 18-year-old by then, who was born just a few months before the fall of Srebrenica, started to rap of hunger inspired by graffiti he painted himself some time ago. The inscription was placed in a love heart on the top of a wooden bench, which was recently reconstructed by an NGO. It said, "Ovdje nema pravde za stomake gladne." Literally translated, "Here is no truth for the hungry stomachs," an excerpt of lyrics from a song composed by Serbian band Size. The song perhaps enabled him to express his own feelings without having to be ashamed about his own situation. It also seemed terribly appropriate to describe post-war Srebrenica. Perhaps a fitting example of those who were not able to succeed in the transition is my friend, whom I nicknamed Emir. I still vividly remember the feeling of shock when Emir admitted that he didn't eat at one point for 3 days. He had no money, but he was too proud to ask for mine or anyone else's help. He was jobless for most of the time we had known each other, some 7 years by now, and I could never accept that this would be simply his fault. He is in his late 30s now, and his body is covered with tattoos of names of his deceased relatives, many of them diminished in Srebrenica in 1995. I have never met a person with such a horrifying life story. When he was a baby, his father killed himself in jail and his mother gave him away. His body was scarred and broken from growing up in orphanages. As a teenager, he was placed to a concentration camp where he was tortured. After the war, Emir ended up in the street without an income and later spent some time in prison. With such a past, finding a regular employment became nearly impossible. In 2014, he decided to undergo a compulsory treatment at the psychiatric ward at the Koševo Hospital in Sarajevo in order to get a veteran financial compensation that he was eligible for. In the end, he never got the benefit as he was unable to finish the bureaucratic procedures and keeps surviving on irregular jobs. For people like Emir, the idea of transitional justice remains abstract and blurry. He hears the term on the TV and from time to time he hears the news on trials with war criminals, but there is no clear sense of transitional justice in his own life. He survived torturing and starvation in concentration camp, but he does not fit into a category of a proper victim because of his problematic past. Ever since the war, he continues to fight unemployment and cannot satisfy even the most basic preconditions of decent life. Neither he can regularly pay the electricity bills, nor he can access regular, safe and nutritious food. In one project with Srebrenica genocide survivors, an elderly woman was asked in an interview what she considers transitional justice. She looked confused and answered that she did not understand and that she is just an ordinary woman and such a question should have been posed to somebody more educated. In my opinion, this was quite a typical view amongst the ordinary people who survived the war. For them, the idea of justice was to be found primarily in the everyday life, starting with the improvement of the material conditions and the general standard of living. The war survivors didn't demand much, namely the access to good quality food, decent employment with income on which they can support the family, and the possibility to get education for their children. Instead, the people who suffered the most in the Bosnian War were often struggling to make their living and complained, after everything we had gone through, you can't even achieve a decent living standard. How dangerous this situation may possibly be showed the 2014 social upheaval in Bosnia when the impoverished citizens united regardless the ethno-national and religious origin and protested against the corrupted political elites. The poverty and inaccessibility of food were frequently mentioned reasons for the protest, during which symbols of power, such as the governmental buildings and police cars, were burned. Thus, even nowadays stays valid what Aristotle had famously stated already centuries ago, that poverty is the parent of revolution and crime. Conclusion. My main argument is overall quite general and simple. I suggest that the understanding of transitional justice should not be understood primarily only in the legal terms, but it should be more practically oriented to better satisfy the needs of the ordinary people who tend to be affected by the war events the most. By this, I do not intend to undermine the importance of the legal processes which took place in the context of the war in former Yugoslavia or other applied projects oriented on transitional justice, such as the economic development via various agricultural projects. They are indeed of great importance, yet these projects often don't reach the people who are impoverished the most, and also they simply cannot outweigh the amount of suffering and injustice experienced by those who lost their closest ones in war and had immensely suffered. This does not mean that they are not helpful, these projects, I mean. What I am trying to suggest is that the domain of transitional justice should encompass also other dimensions of human existence, namely those that are crucial for sustaining life, but also well-being at the most basic level of existence. A more genuine reconciliation and implementation of transitional justice is possible, but only when the basic needs of the ordinary people affected by the war are satisfied and one does not have to fight for daily bread. Thank you for attention.
Thank you very much, Marketa and Yasmin, for these thought-provoking presentations. We have a couple of questions in the question and answer here. Let's see if I can read them for you. Let's see. So this one is for Yasmin, and it says, you mentioned the simplistic banal binary radical leftism of the Bosnian genocide deniers among some Western activist groups. Do you have an explanation for the development of this extreme anti-intellectualism of those self-proclaimed Marxists?
So it's a good question. I think the irony is that I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as anti-intellectualism, because I think these self-styled kind of, especially Marxist anti-imperialists, very much believe that they're engaging in a kind of, dialectical scientific socialism, materialist analysis. I do think, though, that the kind of the fundamental aspect of it really does trace its origins to some of the most reactionary aspects, in particular of Engels's writing. For those of you, for instance, who have read your Marx and Engels in a more thorough way than the Communist Manifesto, which we poli-sci folks assigned to undergraduate students in year one or what have you. That there's, for Engels in particular, there was always a really there was a tense relationship essentially between ethnicity and class, and there's always a weird interplay there. And so in particular in his writings on the 1848 revolutions, and there's a famous text that he wrote about the so-called, what he calls the Magyar struggle, which is the Hungarian Revolution. He has these really sweeping and radical statements about the idea that essentially any peoples, as he puts it, who supported the Austro-Hungarian Empire were inherently reactionary. And he goes on to say, as he puts it, in the next great war, they will have to be exterminated, right? Not just reactionary classes, he says, but reactionary peoples, and adds, this too will be a step forward. Now, I don't know to what extent we can necessarily kind of intellectually do a one-for-one between, Engels' writing in the immediate aftermath of the 1848 revolutions and, a 19-year-old anti-imperialist on Twitter who, writes to me to tell me that I'm a CIA dupe because I write about the Bosnian genocide. But clearly there is a ideological linkage there. And I think the thing to understand about these narratives is that these folks are really categorically committed in the belief that, in particular, the United States, but more broadly, kind of the political West, is uniquely evil, unsalvageably evil. And therefore, any kind of opposition to the political West, even from reactionary nationalist, essentially almost fascist groups like the Mladic, Karadzic, Milosevic, or even, if you want to use a contemporary example, the Assad regime in Syria, that's good. That's fine. They'll have some kind of tangential stuff about maybe how certain things are problematic, but they're primarily concerned about supposedly, debunking, again, the kind of false Western narratives, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, unfortunately, it really comes down to, for them having a really extremist binary view of international relations, which of course also, the extremist nature of their discourses, it makes it very understandable why you have, what some people refer to as these sort of proverbial red-brown alliances, which have reemerged, which is to say that when you look at some of the discourses about the Bosnian genocide that you see on the far left and the far right, there's very little daylight. Right. So because there's a shared methodology, if not necessarily always a shared ideology.
Right. Thank you for that profoundly illuminating response to the question. We have other questions. I'd like to. Am I muted? No.
I'm not hearing you, David.
Can you hear me?
I'm hearing you fine.
Okay. I have a question for Marketa, and the question is why would you think the international community did not intervene to provide food for Srebrenica? And the way it's posed, I suppose it could mean both during the siege of Srebrenica and now, but it probably means during the siege. And I just would add to the question that I recall speaking to Hasan Nuhanovic a few years ago, and he happened to mention the idea that the siege of Srebrenica from 1992 to 1995 was what he called the first phase of the genocide, because the conditions were created precisely as you put it, as the conditions themselves were tools to eliminate the population, because the level of food and so forth being provided did not support life. But can you reflect on the failure of the international community during the siege to provide food?
Yes, thank you for the question, David. It is a very important question, and I have a little bit neglected this topic in my presentation for the time reasons. But well, actually, it's not that the international community or the humanitarian aid wasn't there. It was. They tried to help, but the problem was actually the besiegement of the cities, and that there was this intentional blocking of convoys by the Bosnian Serb army, making sure that actually the humanitarian aid would not get into the enclaves. And in Srebrenica, in the whole first year, there was basically no humanitarian convoys coming, and that's when the situation was actually the worst. Perhaps if there is a little bit of time, I could use a little bit of my slides, which I in the end didn't use, or at least try to share my screen, where I actually have a little bit more regarding that. Can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Okay, I will put it a little bit back. So, well, actually, so what actually happened, that I suggest that during the war, during the entire Bosnian wars, starvation was used as part of the military strategy, which is not really spoken about. And this was done by first besieging the targeted cities such as Srebrenica and Sarajevo, and second by blocking of the humanitarian convoys. So in this slide you can see like how Srebrenica like was besieged, and that it was an enclave, and that you couldn't get basically like, you know, in and out, and there was no basically like, you know, soil where you could grow something on. And this is like a view of Sarajevo. Also, you can see the besiegement. The Sarajevo was partially saved later on by the tunnel underground that actually like was built to provide the supplies of medical material and food, of course. So actually like what still I wanted to say, what happens in this like situation in the war when the town is besieged, like, you know, you don't have any option of growth. Like, you know, as I said before, usually like in war you have general collapse of infrastructure of food production. Like in our societies, most of the food is produced industrially. So when that collapses, people really don't have like, you know, almost any possibilities of providing for themselves, especially in the urban areas, which are like threatened the most, because the agricultural production requires like simply like, you know, a lot of soil, a lot of like land on which you can grow. For example, in Sarajevo, but both in Srebrenica, people try to grow foods even on their balconies, like, you know, in flower pots, but like logically you can't grow much. Well, there was actually also some of the humanitarian aid coming later on, but the problem was that the humanitarian aid was like often actually like, here you have example of like one of the packages that was designed actually specifically for Bosnia. Well, so the humanitarian aid, when it was coming, first it wasn't enough. Like a lot of it actually, according to the eyewitnesses, got misappropriated, and it ended up being sold at the black markets for like, you know, incredible prices that nobody could afford, which was, for example, the case with salt as well in Srebrenica. So that was one factor, but the other factor is that the humanitarian aid is also like designed like, you know, by nutritious discourse, and it contains very specific kind of ingredients that actually the people didn't know what to do with. For example, like, you know, you would get like everything in powder, powdered eggs, powdered milk. That was actually in a better case, and this basically didn't respect any like, you know, previous socio-cultural knowledge in the locality of the people. So sometimes people did not know how to even prepare it. This like actually like required a lot of kind of creativity. And also like the amounts weren't like, you know, so big, so you couldn't really satisfy like your needs properly. Actually, people reacted in Sarajevo to this situation that they started putting together like war cookbooks, which they actually wrote themselves. Here in the picture is example of one of my interlocutors, and this is a recipe how to make this traditional like kind of cheese or clotted cheese called kaimak, but out of like completely different ingredients coming from like, you know, the humanitarian aid. Of course, there was in the urban area, you couldn't get like, for example, fresh milk. So it was all substituted and made from like very, very different things than people were used to. And so I don't know if I should still conclude. Oh, what was another problem with the humanitarian aid is that not that only it didn't come like, you know, like in quantities that were satisfying, but in some cases, actually, like when it came to kind of throwing it from the plane, it could be even dangerous. You have to imagine like that actually, I will say it differently so it's more understandable. As I said before, one of the most, the biggest problems, like why the aid didn't reach the enclave was the besiegement, and that actually the convoys were stopped. There's many eyewitnesses to that, and they've been actually like the food and medical supplies were taken out. And in the case of Srebrenica, salt as well, especially salt. Actually the international community later reacted to this by the decision of actually designing these packages of food and throwing food from the planes. But even that was like a very actually risky task during the war. You can actually read this in a book of Hasan Hasanovic, one of these Srebrenica survivors, who actually is eyewitness to situation when this aid even actually like killed one of his friends. So you have to imagine a huge, like, you know, package, like, you know, very heavy, like falling, like, you know, at night, like, you know, from the plane somewhere to the forest, because actually you never know where it's going to be thrown. And so the expeditions themselves to get the aid were very difficult and very dangerous because of actually the besiegement and the omnipresent snipers, but also they could actually harm the people or actually get broken. This just illustrates further that actually when we talk about humanitarian aid, there is many things that is unspoken of, and actually it wasn't as effective. People themselves, many of them felt actually like second-grade citizens when they had to eat it. And I have heard from my interlocutors that actually literally the UN made them eat garbage. That's how they felt about it. And I can show you a few more examples of that, which actually describe the humanitarian aid as something between, like, you know, necessity for survival, but also humiliation. Iconic is, for example, this meat can of Ikare, which actually many people in Bosnia describe like with these words that not even cats and dogs would eat it. And also I have here some of the most hated foods, like which consisted of lentils, soy, this Ikare meat can, fish can, and Tabasco. I would stop here and yeah, give my word to Yasmin again. Thank you. I hope this explains the situation.
Thank you. So there were multiple reasons, or you could say multiple aspects of the failure of food to reach the citizens, but including the fact that the Serbs were allowed to literally stop the convoys, and in addition to the fact that what was already being sent was not enough to support someone for a long period of time. Now, for Yasmin, we have a question. I don't know if the name is from Timothy Waters, and it's a question about, as I would try to paraphrase it, can you hear me, Yasmin?
Yes, yes.
Oh, good. So the question is, you know, in terms of narratives of denial, the question would be something related to the, you know, what the role of the proceedings and judgments of the ICTY, or the effect of the proceedings and judgments of the ICTY on narratives of denial.
Right. So apologies about the little snafu earlier. I had muted myself. So, you know, my own worst enemy. So I think I'll kind of go in a roundabout way of answering this question, because I feel like this question used to be harder to answer in years prior when things were going a bit better in the West. And now that we've unfortunately lived through this era of the proliferation of systematic disinformation, quote unquote fake news, you know, political leaders actively gaslighting their own constituents, I feel like even Americans and Europeans have a much better understanding for what you know, folks in the Balkans and Bosnia have been living through for the better part of the last 3 or 4 decades, depending on how you want to count. I think the reality is that obviously for scholars and activists, the ICTY is hugely important. I mean, there are and there were flaws with the ICTY's approach. I mean, the classic example to me, for instance, is that the categorization of genocide was limited to Srebrenica, right? I mean, this is why, for instance, I used the term Bosnian genocide in addition to the term the genocide in Srebrenica, because obviously the nature of the crimes that took place in Srebrenica, while unique in their overall unfortunate body count, their nature, the kind of crimes and atrocities that were committed, those were repeated by Serb nationalist forces throughout Bosnia. And obviously what happened in Srebrenica was part of the same political project that resulted in the expulsion, murder, and torture of people in Bijeljina, Žepa, Foča, et cetera, right? So there is a totality of a Bosnian genocide in the same way that obviously we distinguish between the Holocaust and Auschwitz, right? We can distinguish between sort of particular killing places and fields and the broader systematic project. So obviously, the ICTY's work is hugely, hugely important because it has established a internationally recognized literature that is accessible, that is foundational, that scholars will continue to build upon in generations to come. And so to Tim's point here about canonical points of reference, sure, but obviously we are trying to expand the canon, as it were. But unfortunately, and I think the thing to note is that the discourse about the ICTY, in particular in the sort of Serb nationalist camp, and the ICTY is more important for Serb nationalist discourses because it is kind of more local. I think Western negationists and denialists are, depending on what camp they're in, are more or less interested in the ICTY. But basically, the discourse among Serb nationalists has always been that this is a Western imperialist or Western anti-Serb, depending on which narrative you want to go, institution. And so therefore you can dismiss them tutto completo, just, you don't even have to engage with the material. And the only thing that I can liken it, and, to make any kind of sense, I think, for people in places like the United States and Europe, is unfortunately the kind of extreme polarization, for instance, that you're seeing in this country right now, right? I mean, there are certain kinds of people that, if you say to them, hey, there's this really great investigative piece in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, whatever, they're going to dismiss it out of hand because they, are convinced that the mainstream media is fake news. So there's no intellectual exchange that can take place at that point. And they essentially reject the idea of outside authority, right? Outside factual scientific information. So again, I mean, for scholars, for activists, the ICTY is hugely important. Unfortunately, I don't know that the ICTY in and of itself has been particularly successful in, convincing these hardline elements. But again, I don't think that was the job of the ICTY, right? So in that sense, I don't think it's fair to say that like, oh, this is a failing on their part. It's a court, and the court found people guilty. It sent people to prison. It established a clear record of the events. That's, I think, realistically speaking, all that we could have asked for. And also, I think it's also important, who in 1992 or 1993 could have honestly believed that the ICTY would become as important as it has become, especially in the context of international law, right? So I think the ICTY is not just important for the events in Bosnia and the former Yugoslavia, it's hugely important for having evolved the broader body of law as concerns international human rights law for future conflicts and atrocity prevention.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was a very interesting question. Great response. It has struck me that there have been so few convictions for genocide in the ICTY, and one could say maybe even fewer sentences for life in prison. So there have been relatively light sentences, and also early releases. People are released after serving 2/3 of a sentence. Goran Jelicic, who was self-styled, the nickname he gave himself was the Serb Ada, is eligible for release after having committed heinous crimes in Brčko. So what I just thought was a good question. The question is, where does denial find its fuel? How does the Swedish Academy come to give the Nobel Prize to Peter Handke? This came up in the previous panel. And so one wonders, has the ICTY played a role in I think you put it that way, not establishing a convincing narrative, but that's, so I thought that was a good question. I had a quick follow-up question for Marketa that was related to something you said about a lack of employment as part of transitional justice, because there's a relationship between having an income and buying food, and if you can't have a job, you can't purchase the food you need to survive. And this is in post-genocide Srebrenica we're talking about. So I wondered if you'd found empirical evidence on the ground and as part of your research that there are discriminatory practices in terms of hiring young people for employment in Srebrenica if they happen to be Bosniaks.
Thank you for the question. I think that would be quite difficult to answer. I'm not quite sure if I have been witnessing some direct discriminatory practices based on, let's say, this ethno-national religious origin. I would say that they are more subtle, that, especially people in the higher positions, they would not mention that the reason would be the kind of ethno-religious background, but they would find other reasons why not to actually employ that person. But and that's what I've been witnessing actually a lot. When I had been doing research several years ago around actually the remaining metal industry in Srebrenica, because actually there is a metal industry, and in during the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Srebrenica was actually one of the most industrial developed areas in the former Yugoslavia. So some of the factories were renewed, but actually I heard complaints that in one unnamed factory, there were no people of Bosnian Muslim origin working there, even though the kind of head of the factory or the higher officers would never admit that this would be the reason. They said it's purely a coincidence, and because there is such a great unemployment, they just couldn't simply employ these people. So certainly I had come along these kind of complaints from especially the people of Bosnian Muslim origin, but they are very hard to prove, it's actually not that simple. And I think that the biggest problem is actually that there is such a huge unemployment that only those who are lucky or have contacts, can actually get a job. I didn't check the numbers recently, but still a few years ago, people were talking that amongst the young people, there is around 60% of unemployment in Sarajevo, which is the capital city, and which should be the place where you would actually find employment. And my good friends from Sarajevo, who actually decided to move out to Austria, said that she actually was asked to bribe the employer in order to employ her. And many of my other friends joked about that as well, that basically in Bosnia, without connections, you almost have to bribe your potential employer to get the job. So I would say the general problem is the unemployment itself and the rate that is incredibly high actually. And in the last census in Srebrenica, we actually didn't get the exact numbers, because I found out that actually majority of the people were not even registered at the Office of Unemployment, because they weren't eligible for any benefits. So I would say what I had been recently witnessing there amongst the young people, if and that's actually, those are the returnees who returned after the traumatic experience back to the town, which is now anyway emptied out and really stripped of population in comparison to the situation before the war. So they have basically two choices what to do in Srebrenica. One is to survive on some type of food self-provisioning, if they have access to farmland, which luckily they actually generally do, and their own houses. Or they can basically migrate somewhere else, to a bigger city such as Tuzla or Sarajevo, or abroad. Just in several years that I spent in Srebrenica, the amount of young people is smaller and smaller. They are all disappearing, and the more lucky ones actually are going abroad. Just actually a month and something ago, I went for a holiday to Croatia, which was the only place where you could take vacation during this COVID pandemics for Czechs at least. And I met one of my friends from Srebrenica, one of the young guys who recently migrated to Zagreb in order to find job because he was so desperate, and he said, I don't have anything else to do here. Like, it's kind of the end. So this is the situation now. There are basically two possibilities to survive on self food provisioning, like, which means actually like economic marginalization, because you can never sell your products like for a fair price, like, on the market, or like, to leave. So maybe to summarize, to wrap it up, unless there is actually like a future in terms of employment and in terms of establishing some well-being, the situation cannot actually get better. I hope that answers the question.
Oh, well, thanks for a kind of comprehensive answer to my question. It just strikes me that Annex 7, right, of Dayton and guaranteeing the right of return is unlikely to succeed for many reasons, but including genocide denial and the glorification of war criminals and the other efforts at psychological intimidation. But certainly, as you were speaking about the perspective of people on the ground, it's not going to succeed if there's no employment.
No. And well, maybe to just say also something about the Annex 7 in practice. Recently, I had been presenting on the case of Fata Orlovic, whom you very well know. It's a lady on whose land like a huge Orthodox church was built after the war. And according to my latest news, the church was not yet removed, despite actually like she finally won, like, an international, like, case. And now the reason is the coronavirus pandemic, why it hadn't been removed. And here you had, like, the typical example of this, like, okay, the rights to return are guaranteed, but there is no actually promise of a decent life, like, either like, because like, the rights are being violated, like, by other kind of, like, for example, like, kind of the lack of will to really improve the situation, like, and also like poor access, like, to fair education, as the Konjevic Polje protest like showed us, like, recently. And so it's not only about like sustaining a well-being, but it's still like, a lot about like, getting like, this justice at more levels of the kind of everyday life.
Yes, that's an important case. She fought for almost 2 decades.
Yes, two decades.
The European Court of Justice said it should be removed, but it hasn't been removed. Now, I think we have time for a question for Yasmin. It's from Tomislav Letinets, who's a panelist for tomorrow. I like his question because it's somewhat philosophical, and he's asking if the discourse of the far right is appropriating the sort of heroicization of freedom fighters and the anti-colonial struggle. Is it the last act of colonialism to take away and use anti-colonial struggle for political struggle at the heart of colonial center? In this case, is it not genocide denial in the strict sense of the word? It's genocide approval. And I'm thinking of the terrorist you referred to in New Zealand, who was heroizing Radovan Karadzic and served nationalist music on his way to his terrorist act. There's something about refers to Balibar's concept of meta-racism, putting genocide in perspective. But this is the terrorist last act. That's what's interesting about that question. It's the idea of life worth living through the terrorist act.
Right. It's an interesting question. I mean, I honestly can't speak to the sort of colonial, post-colonial aspect, especially vis-a-vis some of the literature, both because I don't think I'm quite as well versed to address that part of it, and it's not really an analytical framework that I use. But I do take the question and I do take the point. I think I think there is something very interesting, I mean, horrifying, but interesting, in the idea that one of the things that you've started seeing with the incorporation of the Bosnian genocide into the discourses of the Western far right is that they've definitely picked up on one particular strand of Serb nationalism, which is the one that basically says the genocide took place and it's a good thing that it did. We did it. We'll do it again if you give us the opportunity. So that's kind of the most hardline version of that discourse. It's different from the one that, for instance, you have peddled by the contemporary government in Banja Luka or Belgrade, which says that, you know, quote unquote, something terrible happened. We don't know what it is, but it wasn't genocide, right? And in any case, all sides committed atrocities, right? This kind of like vagary, mist of disinformation, sort of veil of ignorance kind of approach. What the far right has picked up on, and what some of the more extremist elements in the Serb nationalist community are still, you know, advancing, and certainly something that you'll encounter, you know, for those of you who do read about or are interested in sort of studying the far right and are interested in the kind of contemporary online discourses and narratives of the far right. I mean, this is the stuff that you're going to encounter on places like, you know, 8chan or Reddit, these other kinds of social media platforms where, you know, the whole point is to be as outrageous and extremist and over the top as you can be. And this is the subculture out of which the terrorist in New Zealand also emerges, right? I mean, the whole origin of what online is referred to as the quote unquote remove kebab song. Obviously, you know, it's a Serb nationalist song from the war, but you can see how it has sort of been filtered through these channels or these prisms of this kind of ironic, you know, gallows humor kind of prism lens that is unfortunately very attractive, in particular to a lot of young people, right? I mean, young people all over the world like things that are risque. They like things that seem naughty, that seem bad. And unfortunately, you know, the things that we're having to deal with a lot of today are different forms of online radicalization, right? Whether it's through men's rights advocacy and the so-called manosphere and incels and the far right and the whole lot of it, this is another manifestation of that. But yeah, I mean, I do take the point that you know, one could argue that, you know, the very last stage of genocide is not actually negation and denial. It's doubling back on the kind of celebration of it. And I think, you know, that is a lot of what we're unfortunately having to deal with in the present, especially when you are thinking about somebody like Peter Handke, or you know, for instance, I'm thinking of a book that was published recently by an American scholar, which is a kind of bizarre interview biography of Radovan Karadzic. I won't name the scholar, but you know, it's a very particular form of extremely bizarre revisionism that almost borderline, you know, it's borderline eroticism, for those of you that are familiar with the book My War Criminal. So, you know, there's some again, you know, to my original point of my talk, we are continuing to see revisionist, negationist discourses continue to evolve, and where that evolution goes, we don't always know, but it's clearly taking place.
Thank you. I have what might be a last question from one of our more active questioners, who is anonymous. And I thought this was a good question for both panelists, because it's basically asking how we can build a consensus among academic institutions and in political circles about Srebrenica or even Bosnian genocide denial and revisionism. I think it's an excellent question. It came to me recently also in another form, which was that Balkan Insight emailed me for a comment on the fact that Facebook had decided to prohibit, you know, Holocaust denial and distortion. And the question was, you know, should Facebook also prohibit Srebrenica genocide denial and distortion? And so And I thought this was an excellent question in terms of broadening the discourse. So I don't know if you have an opinion about how we can build consensus in academic culture and political culture, I suppose, globally, including in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll say two very quick things, and then I'll give the last word to Marketa. I mean, one, I think a lot of what I'm doing presently with my work or trying to do is just kind of illustrate a different dimension of relevance. I think for folks in places like the United States, even down to honestly like a law enforcement aspect. I think it's important, for instance, that the police and counterterrorism institutions in the United States are familiar with this particular language and discourse of Bosnian genocide denial, especially because so many contemporary far-right groups, their language, their narratives, their forms of communication are fundamentally rooted in, again, code, irony, detachment. And if you're not always familiar with the language, if you're not familiar, for instance, with the origins of remove kebab, you might think it's just a gaming meme, as a lot of folks have told me, well-meaning folks who, once I've written about it or said something about it, will say to me, like, oh my God, I had no idea. Like, I've seen this all the time, da 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 da. Right. So there's that dimension of it. I think there's also the dimension of it that, again, as we are unfortunately all living through an era of democratic backsliding, it behooves all of us to familiarize ourselves and educate ourselves with the nature and the practices of far right and anti-democratic movements. And again, this is where I think the Bosnian genocide has a lot of salience. Here, we're thinking about, for instance, the aspect of their purported struggle or attempt to dismantle multi-ethnic societies, cosmopolitan societies, right? These fantasies about civil war, racial warfare, right? A lot of which you've actually heard in the context of unfortunately, the elections in the US, or that you even heard in the context of the Brexit referendum in the UK, right? So these are, unfortunately, this has a lot more echoes than we would like to believe. As for how you build those bridges of solidarity, I mean, the thing for me is always that you have to front load the voices and experiences of survivors. You have to front load the experiences of those who have experienced these atrocities on their own skin, as it were, because I think empathy has to be kind of the entryway for all of these conversations. I mean, this is something that we know very well from all the folks that have done work on the Holocaust, right? I mean, how important it is, especially now as we're getting on in the years, to preserve all of those accounts, all of those memories, all of those lived experiences from survivors of the death camps and the ghettos and the whole lot of it, right? I mean, this then creates the architecture. It creates a living world for people and future generations, outsiders, as it were, to enter into these conversations and become allies and supporters. For instance, like Marketa, right? I mean, I think Marketa is going about this in exactly the right way. I mean, she's front loading the experiences of people on the ground and doing so in an ethically and morally responsible way. And I think that's a model that all of us should embody. And that, again, then on the flip side, creates room for further conversations to happen in different kinds of contexts, right? Where we can talk about the Bosnian genocide in the context of the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, or contemporary politics, as I do in some of my work.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was very beautifully said. I don't know if I have much to add to it, because I think you said most of the important things. I think the biggest problem now is perhaps that we lived in this sort of post-factual period, as many have suggested, and also with new digital technologies, now it's like very hard to recognize, especially for the younger generations, what actually might be scientific fact and what is some type of like fiction or fantasy or this like myth that might be actually more seductive for many, like than actually the simple truth, or like, the simple research, which is always like too complicated, too rigid, like, and it doesn't give you like simple answers. So I would say that perhaps like, the way would be like, apart from what Yasmin said, like, greater education. And I see great potential in experiential learning and in actually like, established programs when people could actually like, like join each other from different countries, share their experiences. And, there needs to be empathy, as Yasmin said, like, at the first place, and like desire to listen. Without that, like, we are going nowhere. And this is what we have basically. So through empathy and through critical thinking and through active and experiential learning and through establishing friendships and alliances, like, you know, in these places, and trying to help each other. And that's basically, like, you know, where it all starts, I believe. Wow.
Well, I have the pleasure of thanking Dr. Mujanovic and Dr. Slavkova for their important presentations as part of our program, and also reminding you that we have the keynote speaker at 3:30, Haris Halilovic. So I welcome you back for that in just about half an hour. And Haris Halilovic actually coined this term triumphalism to point out this kind of new 11th stage of genocide denial, which in some ways unique to Bosnia, and setting up, throwing up new obstacles to transitional justice. So thanks for that interesting discussion.
Thank you for making the time.
David, do you have anything to add before we sign off?
Just my thanks to you, and especially to both our panelists for a really fascinating hour and a half. It flew by for me. I certainly missed and regretted not having Tanya Domi here, but it partially and strongly made up for it to have more time to hear from both of you. And thank you also to the participants in the audience. I thought those are some excellent questions, and I enjoyed both the questions, and they were really thought-provoking, and hearing your answers to them. Other than that, it is see you all in half an hour.